Every career has a first day, and every career has a last. There is a morning when a young man walks onto a film set for the first time, inexperienced, unrecognized, uncertain of what waits for him. And there is an afternoon or a night, sometimes many decades later, when the same man walks off a set or off a stage for the final time. Between those two moments lies everything a professional life becomes. For the actors of the golden age of British and Hollywood cinema, the distance between those two moments could be extraordinary. 50 years, 60 years. A first performance in a black and white film shot in a drafty London studio in 1933. A final performance in a colour production filmed along the French Riviera in 1983. In between came wars, marriages, tragedies, triumphs, and a body of work that would define the century of the moving image. This is the story of 5 men, 5 careers, 5 beginnings, and 5 final chapters. And in the space between them, the shape of 5 lives. Some ended on a stage, in front of an audience, in the middle of an act. Some ended quietly in a hospital in Santa Monica, only miles from the studios where they had once been among Hollywood's brightest stars. Some used their last public words to speak openly about an illness that public figures had long been expected to hide, then died 9 days later at home in Clapham. Some ended in the mountains of Switzerland, with a final gesture of quiet defiance. Some died in a Lincolnshire home and were laid to rest between the sons they had outlived. Friday, the 5th of October, 1984. The Lyric Theatre on Shaftesbury Avenue in the West End of London. The evening performance of Joe Orton's black comedy Loot had begun on schedule. In a dressing room upstairs, one of the finest character actors in Britain was preparing for the second act. He had been playing Inspector Truscott, the corrupt, self-important police officer whose pursuit of stolen banknotes drives Orton's savage satire, and his performance had been described in reviews as a masterclass in the particular kind of comic monstrosity Orton had specialized in creating. 6 weeks later, that same performance would receive a posthumous nomination for the Laurence Olivier Award for Comedy Performance of the Year. When the stage manager called for him 15 minutes into the second act, Leonard Rossiter did not appear. Backstage, an assistant went to fetch him. The dressing room door was locked. When it was forced open, Leonard Rossiter was found sitting in an armchair, motionless. He was still alive when the ambulance arrived. Middlesex Hospital was less than a mile away. For 30 minutes, the medical team worked, but the cause of his collapse had been building silently for years. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a thickening of the walls of the heart muscle that produces sudden cardiac death without prior warning. He was 57 years old, 16 days short of his 58th birthday. Leonard Rossiter had not begun acting until he was 27 years old. Born in Wavertree, Liverpool on the 21st of October, 1926, his father John Rossiter had been a barber, killed in an air raid on the city in 1942. Leonard had left school at 16 and worked as an insurance clerk for over a decade before deciding, in 1954, to give himself 2 years in repertory theatre. If it did not work, he would return to the office. 9 years later, he was making his Broadway debut. His first appearance on television had come in 1956 in the BBC play Story Conference. His first film role followed in 1962. The picture was A Kind of Loving, directed by John Schlesinger from the novel by Stan Barstow, one of the defining films of the British New Wave. The leading roles went to Alan Bates and June Ritchie. Rossiter appeared in a small character part, one of the many working actors filling out the naturalistic world Schlesinger was constructing. It placed him firmly within the tradition of British social realism that would shape the first phase of his career. He was 35 years old. What followed was a career of unusual range. 2 collaborations with Stanley Kubrick, Dr. Smyslov in 2001, A Space Odyssey in 1968, and Captain John Quinn in Barry Lyndon in 1975. Further character roles followed in films by Schlesinger and Lindsay Anderson, Billy Liar, This Sporting Life, and much later, Britannia Hospital. But it was British television that made him a household name. Rupert Rigsby in Rising Damp on independent television from 1974. Reginald Perrin at the BBC from 1976. 10 Cinzano commercials with Joan Collins between 1978 and 1983. An advertising campaign of extraordinary cultural resonance in the Britain of its time. In 1984, at 57, he was cast as Inspector Truscott in the West End revival of Joe Orton's Loot at the Ambassador's Theatre, transferring later that year to the Lyric on Shaftesbury Avenue. It was one of the most demanding character parts in the contemporary British repertoire. On the evening of the 5th of October, he arrived at the theatre. The first act passed without incident. During the interval, he retired to his dressing room. 15 minutes into the second act, the crisis began. 6 weeks after his death, at his memorial service at St. Paul's Church in Covent Garden, the Actors' Church of the West End, his lute director Jonathan Lynn delivered the eulogy. It contained a line that circulated in the theatrical profession for years afterwards. "Now that Leonard is up there," Jonathan Lynn told the congregation, "things had better be properly managed. I hope the heavenly gates opened on cue and that the choir of angels is singing in tune. They had better be professional in paradise, because if not, they'll certainly hear about it from Leonard." He had made his first credited film appearance 22 years before he died. He had made his final stage appearance on the evening of his death. He had missed his cue. The choir of angels, one hopes, was singing in tune. The 16th of August, 1993, St. John's Hospital and Health Center in Santa Monica, California, some 15 miles west of the Metro Goldwyn Mayer studios, where 40 years earlier, the man whose life was ending here had been one of the most photographed, most desired, and most talked about leading men on earth. Stewart Granger was 80 years old. The prostate cancer that had been diagnosed some time earlier had spread to his bones. He faced the illness with the same pragmatism that had characterized his approach to every difficulty across a life that had contained no shortage of them. He had not sought publicity. He had not given interviews about his condition. He lived quietly in the small home he had taken after his return to California, and the world that had once queued in the foyers of cinemas across 50 nations to watch him fight and love and triumph in glorious Technicolor had, in the main, forgotten what he had been. He died in hospital. His remains were cremated. He had been born 80 years earlier, on the 6th of May, 1913, at Old Brompton Road in Kensington. His given name was James LeBlanc Stewart. His mother, Frederica Eliza LeBlanc, was the great-granddaughter of Luigi LeBlanc, the operatic bass who had been the personal singing teacher of Queen Victoria. His father, Major James Stewart, was a British Army officer decorated with the Order of the British Empire. His first screen appearance came in 1933 as an uncredited extra in a picture called The Song You Gave Me. He was 20 years old. He then trained at the Webber Douglas Academy of Dramatic Art, passed through repertory theatre in Hull and Birmingham, and changed his stage name because another James Stewart, the young American from Pennsylvania, was beginning a Hollywood career that would eventually make coexistence impossible. He took the name Granger from his Scottish grandmother's maiden name. To his friends, off-screen, he would remain Jimmy for the rest of his life. The war came. He was commissioned into the Gordon Highlanders in 1940 and transferred to the Black Watch as a second lieutenant. Stomach ulcers rendered him unfit for active service, and he was invalided out in 1942. His first major film was The Man in Grey, released in 1943, directed by Leslie Arliss for Gainsborough Pictures. It starred James Mason, Margaret Lockwood, Phyllis Calvert, and, in his first leading role, Stewart Granger as the romantic hero Peter Rokeby, the decent counterpart to Mason's brilliant cold-eyed villainy in a Regency-set melodrama that packed the cinemas of wartime Britain. The film transformed all four leading players into stars overnight. He was 30 years old. The Hollywood decade that followed defined his legend. Metro Goldwyn Mayer signed him in 1950, King Solomon's Mines that same year alongside Deborah Kerr, Scaramouche in 1952, containing the 6-minute 30-second climactic sword fight described repeatedly as the finest ever committed to film. Young Bess in 1953, playing Thomas Seymour opposite his own wife Jean Simmons in the title role. Beau Brummel in 1954, Greenfire opposite Grace Kelly before she left Hollywood to marry Prince Rainier of Monaco. Moonfleet under Fritz Lang in 1955, North to Alaska opposite John Wayne in 1960. He married 3 times, Elspeth March from 1938 to 1948, Jean Simmons from 1950 to 1960, the Belgian model Caroline Le Cerf from 1964 to 1969. He fathered 4 children. In 1967, he renounced the American citizenship he had taken 11 years earlier and recovered his original British nationality. The Wild Geese, released in 1978, was his last major theatrical film. But it was not the end of his screen career. He continued to appear on television into 1991. On the 20th of November, 1989, at the age of 76, he made his Broadway debut in The Circle by W. Somerset Maugham at the Ambassador Theatre, alongside Rex Harrison and Glynis Johns. The production had begun previews 6 days earlier and would run until the 20th of May, 1990. It would prove Rex Harrison's final Broadway production. Harrison died 13 days after the run closed. For Stewart Granger, it was a late American stage triumph, not an ending invented by publicity, but a genuine first, his Broadway debut at 76. His closest friend of 40 years, the actor Michael Wilding, had died in 1979. His early professional rival, and later closest friend, James Mason, had died in 1984. His 3 marriages had all ended in divorce. He lived alone in Santa Monica in his final years, in poor health, and with the reduced company that old age inevitably brings to a man who has outlived so many of those who had shared the great years. He died at St. John's Hospital. The tributes that followed his death were warm and genuine, but they came from a smaller circle than they would have 30 years earlier. He had made his first screen appearance 60 years before he died. One of his final television appearances had come only 2 years before. It was a quiet ending for a man who had lived so very loudly. The sword had been put up. The Technicolor had faded to the softer tones of time. The 3rd of September, 1995. Listeners to BBC Radio 4 heard a man of 61, visibly ill and breathing with difficulty, make a 5-minute appeal on the Sunday morning programme, The Week's Good Cause. His subject was the Manic Depression Fellowship, the charity that supported people living with bipolar disorder in Britain. 9 years earlier, he had suffered a severe manic episode following the death of his wife and had been hospitalized. He had been treated with lithium since. At a time when public figures rarely discussed bipolar disorder openly, he chose not to hide what had happened to him. By then, he was gravely ill. Rheumatic fever in childhood had scarred his heart valves. Years of heavy smoking, fluid retention, and declining health had placed his damaged heart under increasing strain. He closed his broadcast with this. 9 days later, on the 12th of September, 1995, at his home in the London district of Clapham, Jeremy Brett died of cardiomyopathy. He was 61 years old. His best friend of 41 years, the actor Robert Stevens, died from complications following surgery exactly 2 months later. The 2 men who had shared rooms and roles and had served as each other's best man since meeting at the Old Vic in 1954 had joined each other in the same season. He had been born Peter Jeremy William Huggins on the 3rd of November 1933 at Berkswell Grange in Warwickshire. His father was Colonel Henry William Huggins, an officer of the Sherwood Foresters and later High Sheriff of Warwickshire. His mother came from the Cadbury chocolate manufacturing family. He was educated at Eton College. His original ambition had been to be a jockey. He grew too tall. He trained at the Central School of Speech and Drama in London and graduated in 1954. His first professional engagement was at the Library Theatre in Manchester. His first major film role came in 1956. War and Peace, directed by King Vidor, the Paramount Pictures adaptation of Tolstoy's novel, was one of the most ambitious productions of its era. Audrey Hepburn was cast as Natasha Rostova. Henry Fonda played the philosophical Pierre, and the 22-year-old Jeremy Brett was cast as Nikolai Rostov, Natasha's brother, the young officer whose military service across the campaign years provides the novel with much of its combat narrative. He had made his major film debut opposite one of the most beloved leading ladies in the history of cinema. The years that followed placed him at the center of the transatlantic theatrical world of his generation. In 1958, he married the actress Anna Massey, daughter of the Hollywood veteran Raymond Massey, with whom he had a son. The marriage ended in 1962. In 1964, he was cast as Freddie Ainsford Hill in the Hollywood adaptation of My Fair Lady, directed by George Cukor. He was twice under consideration for the role of James Bond. He married the American public television producer Joan Wilson in 1976. She died of ovarian cancer in 1985. He never fully recovered. He had been cast as Sherlock Holmes by Granada Television in 1984. Over the 10 years that followed, Jeremy Brett appeared in 41 episodes across 4 series. His interpretation was, by consensus of critics and by the enduring judgment of audiences, the definitive screen Holmes of the 20th century. He read every original Conan Doyle story before beginning production and kept a 77-page notebook, his so-called Baker Street file, recording the characters' habits, mannerisms, food, drink, and appearance. The strain of the role took a terrible toll. His grief following Joan's death, combined with the pressure of playing so demanding a character across nearly a decade, contributed to the manic episode of 1986 for which he was hospitalized. The lithium treatment that followed brought weight gain, tremors, and cardiovascular strain. He continued to work. The final Sherlock series, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, was completed in 1994. He was in poor health throughout. 6 episodes were produced. In one, The Mazarin Stone, he appears only in the opening and final scenes, while Mycroft Holmes, played by Charles Gray, carries much of the case, an accommodation made necessary by Brett's declining state. It was his final performance as Holmes, and his final completed television work. A brief, uncredited appearance in Mole Flanders had already been filmed. It was released posthumously in 1996, the last new image of Jeremy Brett to reach a cinema screen. His ashes were interred in the family chapel at Wargrave in Berkshire. His memorial service was held at St Martin in the Fields in London. He had made his first major film appearance 39 years before his death. He had spoken the last public words of a career defined by 2 extraordinary things: his portrayal of the world's most famous fictional detective, and his refusal to remain silent about an illness that had, until his advocacy, been almost universally hidden by public figures in his profession. Streets ahead of us, still. 1962, the 20th Century Fox production of The Longest Day was in the middle of principal photography in Normandy. Some 3,000 extras, 48 international stars, sequences filmed on the actual beaches where the largest amphibious operation in the history of warfare had begun 18 years earlier. One of the smaller but pivotal roles was that of Major John Howard, the officer who had commanded the glider assault on the Bénouville Bridge over the Caen Canal. Howard's 6 Horsa gliders had crash-landed in the darkness at 17 minutes past midnight on the 6th of June, 1944, the first Allied objective seized on D-Day, hours before the amphibious landings began at dawn. The producers cast the role with an English actor of considerable distinction. His name was Richard Todd. What the audience of The Longest Day did not know, but that a small number of British veterans of the Normandy operation certainly did, was that Richard Todd had already been at that bridge, in the darkness, on the 6th of June, 1944. Not as an actor, as a soldier. Lieutenant Richard Andrew Palathorpe Todd, of the 7th Light Infantry Battalion of the British Parachute Regiment, had been among the first British officers to land in Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944. His battalion had jumped in the darkness of the pre-dawn hours to reinforce Major Howard's glider force at the Bénouville Bridge. Todd's task, and that of his fellow paratroopers, was to hold the bridge against the inevitable German counterattacks until the amphibious forces from the beaches could arrive. They did hold it. Captain Todd survived. The bridge, later renamed Pegasus Bridge in honour of the winged horse emblem of the British Airborne, was one of the pivotal early objectives of D-Day. 18 years later, Richard Todd, actor, was walking those same Normandy locations, playing Major John Howard, the officer he had fought alongside in the darkness before dawn. He was walking through the ground of his own history. He had been born on the 11th of June 1919 in Dublin, Ireland. His father was Dr. Andrew William Palathorpe Todd, a physician who had also represented Ireland at international rugby 3 times. He spent much of his childhood in India, where his father served as an army physician. He was educated at Shrewsbury School, gave his first professional stage performance at 18, and in 1939, at the age of 20, was one of the co-founders of the Dundee Repertory Theatre. He was commissioned in the British Army in 1941. His D-Day service is a matter of military record. He was demobilised in 1946. In 1949, his first film was released. The title was For Them That Trespass, directed by Alberto Cavalcanti, the Brazilian-born filmmaker who had been one of the most inventive documentary directors of the wartime British Ministry of Information. The picture was shot at Elstree Studios in Boreham Wood, the first major film produced there after the studio's post-war reopening. Todd played Herb Logan, a working-class Londoner falsely convicted of murder. Co-starring was Kenneth More in one of his earliest featured roles. Todd was 30 years old. It was his screen debut. Before 1949 had ended, he had made a second picture, The Hasty Heart, directed by Vincent Sherman for Warner Brothers, from the play by John Patrick. He played Corporal Lachlan MacLachlan, a proud, prickly Scots infantryman in a British military hospital in Burma. His American wardmate was played by Ronald Reagan, then in the middle phase of his Hollywood career and 30 years distant from the White House. Todd was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actor. It was his second film. What followed was a 15-year run at the peak of the British film industry. Stage Fright in 1950 for Alfred Hitchcock, alongside Marlene Dietrich and Jane Wyman. 3 Disney pictures, A Man Called Peter in 1955. And in the same year, the film for which many British audiences would remember him longest, The Dam Busters, in which he played Wing Commander Guy Gibson, Victoria Cross, leading 617 Squadron on the Mona and Ada Dam raids of May 1943. He was appointed an Officer of the Order of the British Empire in 1993, and in his later years came the 2 losses from which he never recovered. His younger son, Seamus Palathorpe Todd, took his own life at the age of 20 in 1997. An inquest heard evidence that his death may have been a depressive reaction to acne medication. 8 years later, in 2005, Todd's elder son Peter also took his own life. Richard Todd said very little about either loss. He was a soldier. He had served in the darkness before dawn on the 6th of June, 1944. He knew that not every grief is offered up to be shared. He visited his son's adjoining graves regularly. In his last years, he lived in the small Lincolnshire village of Little Humby, in a modest home with a garden he tended himself. He continued to give occasional stage performances into his 80s. He wrote 2 volumes of autobiography. His final screen appearance came in 2007 in an episode of the independent television drama Heartbeat called Seeds of Destruction. He played Major Harold Beecham, an old soldier carrying one final story. He died on the 3rd of December 2009 of cancer at his home in Little Humby, aged 90. He was buried at St Guthlac's Church in Little Ponton, between the graves of his sons Peter and Seamus. He had made his first film 60 years before his death. His final screen appearance had come 58 years after that debut. He had come to the cinema from a Normandy field in which he had already fought a war. He had played, on screen, the officer he had fought alongside in the darkness. He had outlived 2 of his own sons, and at the last, he was laid to rest between them. The bridge, Pegasus Bridge, still crosses the Caen Canal. The summer of 1983. A dubbing studio somewhere in the film production world of Britain and Europe. An American comedian and impressionist named Rich Little sat before a microphone, watching a completed scene on a monitor. On the screen appeared David Niven, the pencil moustache, the twinkling eyes, the unmistakable elegance of the man who for half a century had defined a particular kind of English cinematic charm. Niven was on screen. His lips were moving. But it was Rich Little's voice, a careful, respectful imitation of the Niven diction, that came out of Niven's mouth. The film was called Curse of the Pink Panther. It was the last film of Niven's career. By 1983, motor neurone disease, the progressive degenerative condition also called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, had destroyed his ability to speak clearly. His voice, that famous instrument that had charmed audiences through 90 films across half a century, was gone. Rich Little dubbed his dialogue. Niven appeared on screen. His voice was another man's. He had continued to work. He had been born on the 1st of March 1910 in central London. His father, Lieutenant William Niven of the Berkshire Yeomanry, was killed at Gallipoli in 1915 when David was 5 years old. His mother was descended from a Welsh military family. Her father, David Niven's maternal grandfather, was Captain William Degacher of the 24th Regiment of Foot, killed at the Battle of Isandlwana in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. Niven's family had lost 2 generations of men to 2 of the more famous military disasters of the British Empire. He was educated at Stowe School and passed on to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. In 1933, at the age of 23, He resigned his commission by telegram halfway across the Atlantic and sailed for the United States. His early Hollywood screen work came in 1935. One of those appearances was Mutiny on the Bounty, produced by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and directed by Frank Lloyd. The stars were Charles Laughton as Captain Bligh and Clark Gable as Fletcher Christian. It was one of the most prestigious productions of the studio's mid-decade output and would win the Academy Award for Best Picture that year. Niven appeared as an uncredited extra. Around the same period, another day's work paid him $2.50 to play a spray-painted Mexican in a low-budget cowboy picture. By the end of 1935, he had been signed by the producer Samuel Goldwyn, who would remain his employer for the next 15 years. He was 25 years old. His breakthrough came in 1936, with the charge of the Light Brigade at Warner Brothers, alongside his close friend and housemate Errol Flynn. Wuthering Heights in 1939. Raffles in the same year. By late 1939, he was firmly established among Hollywood's leading British-born players. Then Britain declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, and David Niven made the decision that defined his moral character for the rest of his life. He returned to Britain. He was the only major British star in Hollywood to do so. He was recommissioned into the British Army in the Rifle Brigade. He volunteered for the newly formed Commandos. He served in the Special Reconnaissance Regiment known as Phantom and rose to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. During the making of the wartime film The Way Ahead, a young private named Peter Ustinov, one of the film's writers, was assigned as his orderly. He came ashore in Normandy some days after D-Day. He was present at the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes in December 1944. He was decorated by the United States with the Legion of Merit. His first wife, Primmy, died on the 21st of May, 1946, at the age of 28, from injuries sustained when she fell down a stone staircase during a party game at the Hollywood home of Tyrone Power. His grief was complete. He married the Swedish model Hjördis Genberg in January 1948. Their marriage lasted for the remaining 35 years of his life. The great professional recognition of his career came in 1958. Separate tables cast him as Major David Angus Pollock, a pathetic figure who has for years falsely claimed a distinguished war record and who is now facing exposure. It was a role of profound irony for a man whose own war service had been genuine. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor. His performance ran 23 minutes and 39 seconds on screen, the shortest Best Actor performance ever to win the Academy Award. His autobiography, The Moon's a Balloon, published 1971, became an international bestseller. The symptoms of motor neuron disease had first appeared in 1980. He continued to work through his diagnosis. Trail of the Pink Panther in 1982, Curse of the Pink Panther in 1983, the film for which his voice was dubbed by Rich Little. His weight fell drastically. Friends who visited him, Roger Moore, who had become one of the closest of his final years, saw a man visibly wasting away. The debonair charm that audiences had loved was not a mask he wore. It was an essential fact about him, and it did not desert him. In mid-July 1983, he moved to his Swiss chalet at Châteaudet near Gstaad. On the morning of Friday the 29th of July, 1983, at 7 o'clock, David Niven died peacefully in his sleep. He was 73 years old. His nephew Michael Rangdad announced the death. The statement contained one detail. He had faced fascism at 29. He had faced the sudden death of his young wife at 36. He had faced motor neuron disease at 70, and he had signed off, as the audience had always loved him for signing off, with a small gesture of optimism. His Hollywood career had begun in 1935, in the uncredited margins of studio pictures. It ended in 1983, in a film in which his voice was dubbed by another man, because his own could no longer be understood. Between those 2 points lay 48 years, more than 90 films, 1 Academy Award, and 1 thumbs up. 5 men, 5 careers, 5 beginnings, and 5 final chapters, and between them, the shape of 5 lives. Leonard Rossiter, aged 57, in a locked dressing room at the Lyric Theatre, one Friday evening in October 1984, having missed his cue for the second act. 22 years between the first and the last. The choir of angels singing in tune. Stewart Granger, aged 80, at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica, California, in August 1993. Nearly 60 years of screen work behind him. The Technicolor fading to the softer tones of time. Jeremy Brett, aged 61, at his home in Clapham in South London, one Tuesday in September 1995, after years of cardiac illness. 11 years after Leonard Rossiter's sudden death had opened this story with another damaged heart. Streets ahead of us, still. Richard Todd, aged 90, at his home in Little Humby in Lincolnshire, one December morning in 2009, after outliving two of his own sons. 58 years between his first film and his final screen appearance. The bridge still standing. The churchyard in Lincolnshire. David Niven, aged 73, at his chalet in the Swiss Alps, one Friday morning in July 1983, of motor neurone disease. 48 years from the uncredited margins of Hollywood to his final film. Thumbs up. Goodnight. Every career has a first day and a last. For the men who worked in the cinema and on the theatrical stages of the 20th century, the arcs that connected those 2 points contained everything a professional life can contain. Wars, marriages, bereavements, triumphs, failures, and at the last, the quiet moment when the work is finished. Leonard Rossiter, missing his cue. Stewart Granger, alone in Santa Monica. Jeremy Brett, streets ahead of us, still. Richard Todd, between his sons. David Niven, thumbs up. 5 beginnings, 5 final chapters, and in between them, 5 lives that gave to the audiences of the 20th century the best of what the cinema, at its most generous and most honest, has always been able to give. If you have enjoyed this documentary on the first and last roles of 5 British and Hollywood legends, please consider subscribing to Cinema Peak for more stories like this. Your support truly means a lot. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.